Would you believe me if I told you that someone could be screaming for help right in front of you, and no one would hear? They laughed when the mailman said someone answered the doorbell at that house. The abandoned house on Maple Street had been empty for 12 years, or at least that's what everyone thought. But on that rainy October night, something was different. And what Mark Sullivan discovered behind that door would forever change the history of a small town in Oregon. This is the true story of an ordinary man who refused to give up, and of a secret that remained hidden for over a decade. A story that will make you question, how many times have you passed by someone who needed help and simply didn't realize it? Stay with me until the end, because what you're about to discover will send shivers down your spine. Imagine the scene: a gray Victorian mansion, broken windows, a garden completely overgrown with weeds, the kind of place children avoid on Halloween, that adults cross the street to avoid. Everyone in the town of Riverside, Oregon knew that house, and everyone was absolutely certain that no one lived there. The owner, Eleanor Whitmore, had disappeared without a trace in 2011. Case closed, page turned, end of discussion. But Mark Sullivan, a dedicated 43-year-old mailman, never managed to turn the page completely. Every day he passed by that house, every day he carried letters addressed to a woman no one else was looking for, and every day something inside him whispered that something was wrong with that story. Have you ever felt that? That nagging intuition that won't leave you alone, even when everyone says you're crazy? It was this intuition that led Mark to make a decision that Halloween night. A simple, almost insignificant decision to ring the doorbell twice. And what happened in the following seconds would prove that sometimes the difference between life and death lies in believing what your instincts are screaming. What you're about to discover may surprise you, and perhaps even change the way you look at the world around you. Before I tell you what happened when Mark rang that doorbell for the second time, I need to ask you something. If this story is affecting you, if it's somehow touching your heart or making you rethink your own experiences, leave a comment below. Tell me, have you ever ignored your intuition and regretted it later? Or have you ever followed that inner voice and saved a situation? I know this topic resonates with you, and your story could inspire someone reading this now. And look, if you're enjoying this content, click the like button. It seems silly, but this simple gesture shows me that it's worth continuing to bring real stories like this one, which make us believe in human kindness again. Your participation here is what makes this channel grow and reach more people with this type of content. And if you're not yet subscribed, subscribe now and activate the bell, because every week I bring stories that will move you, make you think, and above all, remind you that small actions can change entire lives. Because that's exactly what this story is about not giving up when everyone doubts you, about doing the right thing even when it seems like you're alone. And believe me, what Mark was about to discover on that rainy Halloween night would prove that persisting, even when ridiculed, can be the difference between tragedy and miracle. Mark Sullivan wasn't some movie hero. At 43, he was just an ordinary mailman, the kind you pass on the street and barely notice. But there was something special about how Mark approached his job. 18 years delivering mail in Riverside, Oregon. 18 years knowing every street, every house, every neighbor by name. He was one of those rare professionals who took their work seriously, who delivered mail even in torrential rain, heavy snow, or the scorching summer heat. For Mark, each envelope held a story. Each package represented someone's hope. An important bill, a love letter, family news, documents that could change lives. He understood that his job was much more than simply putting paper in mailboxes. It was about human connection. It was about keeping people connected to each other, even if they never knew it. But there was one address that always disturbed Mark's peace of mind, a place that represented a failure in his daily mission. Number 1847 Maple Street. That old, grey, imposing and somber Victorian mansion, with its broken windows reflecting the cloudy Oregon sky, and a garden completely overgrown with tall grass that looked more like an urban jungle. The house had been abandoned since 2011, when its owner, Eleanor Whitmore, simply disappeared from the face of the earth. Nobody knew what had happened to her. One day, Eleanor was there, going to church on Sundays, buying vegetables at the local market, greeting neighbors with her shy smile. The next day, she disappeared. Without warning, without explanation, without a trace. The police investigated, of course. Neighbors were interviewed, the house was inspected, but nothing. Absolutely nothing to indicate violence, a planned escape, or any clue to the whereabouts of that 67-year-old woman. And Mark, day after day, month after month, year after year, passed by that house. And day after day, mail addressed to Eleanor Whitmore piled up in his mail van. Letters from the bank, utility bills, advertising. Official announcements. Papers that had nowhere to go. Papers that Mark was forced to mark as addressee unknown and return to sender. Each time he stamped those words, he felt a tightness in his chest. A strange feeling that he was failing in his mission, even knowing there was nothing he could do. But what bothered Mark most wasn't just the undelivered letters. It was that house, that silent, somber presence that seemed to watch him every morning as he passed by. Something was wrong there. He felt it in his bones, a hidden truth waiting to be discovered. His colleagues joked that he was obsessed. His wife said he needed to learn to disconnect from work. But Mark couldn't, because for him, Eleanor Whitmore wasn't just a name on returned envelopes. She was a real person who deserved to be remembered, sought, found. And it was this quiet determination, this refusal to simply move on and forget, that was about to completely transform Mark Sullivan's journey. Because sometimes life's greatest revelations happen precisely when we refuse to accept that something is simply over. It was October 31st, 2023. Halloween. The sky over Riverside was heavy and overcast, pouring down a cold, steady rain that turned the streets into grey mirrors. Mark was driving his van through the familiar neighborhoods, making his usual deliveries, when he glanced at the stack of mail beside him and saw something different. A bright yellow envelope. Registered letter. Urgent. Recipient. Eleanor. Whitmore, 1847 Maple Street. Sender, Morrison & Associates Law Firm. Mark's heart skipped a beat. Registered letters were different. They required a signature. They required confirmation that someone had actually received the document. You couldn't simply return them like the others. By postal regulations, he needed to at least attempt delivery in person. It was his last chance to do what he had been putting off for years, knock on that door and be absolutely certain that no one was there. When he stopped the van in front of number 1847, the rain was falling even harder. The drops hit the windshield with an almost aggressive intensity, as if the universe itself were trying to warn him of something. Mark looked at the house through the fogged glass. There it was, imposing and terrifying as always, even darker under the dark Halloween sky. For a moment he thought about simply marking it as a failed delivery attempt and leaving. It would be easier, safer, more logical. But then he thought of Eleanor. Had she really just vanished? Didn't she deserve one last chance? Mark held the yellow envelope, tucked it under his coat to protect it from the rain, and got out of the van. The icy wind cut his face immediately. He walked through the abandoned garden, dodging branches and tall grass that encroached on the broken stone path leading to the main entrance. The porch steps creaked loudly beneath his feet. The wood was visibly rotten, dangerous, stained with mold and dampness. Mark felt his heart race. Something was profoundly wrong with that place, something that went beyond physical neglect. It was a visceral feeling, as if the house itself were laden with sadness and secrets. He reached out with a trembling hand and rang the old doorbell. The sound echoed inside the house, muffled and distant. He waited. 10 seconds. 15 seconds. Absolute silence, except for the rain hammering on the roof. Mark was already turning to go down the stairs when that inner voice spoke again, the same one that had been bothering him for years, the same one that never left him in peace. I'll play again, he thought, almost as a challenge to his own fear. And he played, for the second time. And that's exactly when everything changed, when the reality he knew shattered in two. Footsteps. He heard footsteps coming from inside the house, slow, dragging, as if whoever was walking had difficulty moving. The sound was unmistakable. It wasn't the creaking of old wood. It wasn't the wind. They were human footsteps. Someone was approaching the door. Mark's heart raced. His hands began to sweat despite the cold. He froze, his eyes fixed on the rusty doorknob, and then it began to turn, slowly, inch by inch. The old door groaned as it opened just a tiny crack, and in the absolute darkness inside, Mark saw an eye, a human eye, wide open, desperate, watching him through that small opening. An eye that seemed to carry years of suffering, of loneliness, of almost extinguished hope. An eye that silently pleaded for help. Mark froze. Every fiber of his being screamed that this was impossible. That house was empty. Everyone knew it. The police had checked. The city hall had inspected. But there was the truth, staring directly at him through a dark crack. Someone was alive in that house. Someone was trapped. And that someone had heard the doorbell ring twice and found the strength to drag themselves to the door. This decision to play a second time was about to reveal something that would change not only Mark's life, but that of an entire community that was sure it knew its own story. If you're feeling the impact of this twist, subscribe to the channel, because what's coming next will show you how the courage of an ordinary person can uncover secrets that have been hidden for over a decade. Mark ran back to the van in the rain, his heart pounding so hard it felt like it was going to burst out of his chest. His hands trembled as he gripped the steering wheel. Cold sweat trickled down his forehead, mingling with the raindrops. He could barely process what he had just seen. That eye, that desperate gaze piercing the darkness. Someone was alive in that house. Someone needed urgent help. He drove straight to the post office, almost skidding on the wet curves, adrenaline coursing through every muscle in his body. When he arrived, still breathless, he burst into the room where his colleagues were finishing organizing the day's deliveries. "There's someone." "At the house on Maple Street," he shouted, his voice louder than he intended. "Eleanor or someone is in there. I saw them. Someone opened the door." The silence that followed lasted only 2 seconds before the laughter began. Laughter, not malicious laughter, but that kind of nervous, condescending laughter of someone who thinks they're dealing with someone who has completely lost their mind. Jim, his supervisor of 10 years, a robust man in his 50s, approached and patted Mark on the shoulder with the expression of someone dealing with a frightened child. "Mark, buddy, you worked too hard today. It's Halloween, everyone's kind of tense with these ghost stories. That house is empty, man. The city has inspected it 1,000 times. Social services went there, nobody's there." The other mailmen shook their heads, some still chuckling softly. To them, Mark had finally snapped after years of obsessing over that cursed address. But Mark didn't give up. He ran out of the gas station and went straight to the police precinct, 3 blocks away. He entered wet and desperate, interrupting the quiet afternoon shift. Officer Rodriguez, an experienced policeman of Mexican origin who knew Mark by sight, greeted him politely, but with that skeptical look of someone who has heard too much. "Mr. Sullivan, look, I understand your concern, but we've responded to 3 calls about that house in recent years. Neighbors reporting strange lights, noises, that sort of thing. Every time we went there, the house was completely empty, locked, no signs of forced entry. It was probably just a homeless person who managed to get in, or maybe even your imagination. That house has a reputation for being haunted. You know how it is." Mark tried to explain. He tried to describe the eye he saw, the doorknob turning, the shuffling footsteps. But the more he spoke, the more he noticed the growing skepticism on the policeman's face. "I'll write down your account here, okay? If we can get a free patrol car, we'll stop by. But honestly, Mr. Sullivan, I think you saw a shadow or some kind of reflection. That house messes with people's heads." And that was it, noted and filed away. Another crazy story about the abandoned house on Maple Street. When he arrived home that night, soaked and emotionally exhausted, Mark tried to talk to Karen, his wife of 15 years. She was preparing dinner, and when he began to speak, she stopped, turned, and looked at him with that expression he knew so well. Genuine concern. "Honey, you've been very stressed lately. Maybe it's time to take a few days off, you know. You have accumulated vacation time. We can travel, Relax a bit. This obsession with that house isn't doing you any good. Even the person who loved him most in the world thought he was losing control. That night, lying in bed, staring at the dark ceiling of the room, Mark felt something he had never felt before. Absolute loneliness. He knew what he had seen. He was absolutely certain that eye was real, that person needed help, but everyone, literally everyone, thought he was crazy, tired, imagining things. The collective mentality had decided that the house was empty, and any evidence to the contrary was simply dismissed as impossible. But do you know what separates ordinary people from people who change history? The ability to trust your own truth, even when the whole world tells you you're wrong. And Mark was about to make a decision that would prove that sometimes the line between sanity and madness is just the difference between giving up and persisting. For the next few days, Mark barely slept. That desperate eye haunted him in every quiet moment. He knew no one would do anything. The police had filed his report away as just another crazy story. His colleagues thought he was overwhelmed. His own wife suggested therapy. If anyone was going to uncover the truth about that house, it would have to be him. And that's exactly what Mark decided to do. He began his solitary investigation at the Riverside Public Library, an old red-brick building in the city center. He spent hours immersed in old newspaper archives, public records, any information he could find about Eleanor Whitmore. And what he discovered painted a painfully clear picture of an ordinary life that simply vanished without explanation. Eleanor had been an English teacher at the local high school for 32 years. She retired in 2005 at the age of 61. She was described by former students as demanding but fair, passionate about classical literature. She had no children. She never married. She lived alone in that large Victorian house that had been in her family for generations. At 67, when she disappeared, Eleanor was a woman with no known close family ties. Neighbors unanimously described her as reserved and gentle. Someone who greeted politely but didn't get too involved. Someone who simply occupied her space in the world discreetly. And then in September 2011, she simply ceased to exist. She stopped showing up for Sunday Mass at the Methodist church she had attended for decades. She was no longer seen at the market doing her weekly shopping. She didn't answer calls from the church administration asking if everything was all right. The police opened an official investigation after 2 weeks. They entered the house with a warrant. They found everything in order. Clothes in the closet, food in the refrigerator, no sign of struggle or violence, as if Eleanor had simply evaporated. No signs of a planned escape, no suspicious bank transactions, absolutely nothing to indicate where she had gone or why. The case went cold within months. Eleanor was officially declared missing, and the house was sealed off by the city as abandoned property awaiting legal resolution. And there it remained for 12 years, accumulating dust and ghost stories. But Mark wasn't interested in ghosts. He was interested in hidden truths that everyone had stopped looking for. He began chatting discreetly with longtime neighbors who still lived on Maple Street. He was careful, casual, as if he were merely satisfying his curiosity during his deliveries. Mrs. Chen, an Asian woman in her 80s, who lived next door to number 1847, said something that made Mark's heart race. "Sometimes at night I swear I see a faint light moving inside, like a flashlight or a candle. But my husband says it's just my old eyes playing tricks on me. He says I watch too much television and I'm seeing things." Mr. Patterson, a retired veteran who lived across the street, revealed another crucial piece of the puzzle. There was a nephew, you know. Vincent, I think that was his name. He would visit Eleanor from time to time. Nice car, expensive clothes. But after she disappeared, he showed up once, locked everything up with new padlocks, and never came back. I always found that strange. If my aunt disappeared, I'd be turning heaven and earth. Upside down looking for her, not locking up the house and disappearing. The pieces began to fit together in Mark's mind, like a macabre puzzle. A woman alone, no close family, a nephew who appeared occasionally, an unexplained disappearance, and then that same nephew locking the house and disappearing as well, and those lights that Mrs. Chen swore she saw at night, and finally that desperate eye that had looked at Mark through the dark crack. It wasn't madness, It wasn't imagination. There was a hidden history in that house. A truth that everyone agreed to forget simply because it was easier to believe that Eleanor had left than to face darker possibilities. And Mark was beginning to mentally construct a terrifying scenario. If you're feeling the impact of this revelation, subscribe to the channel, because what Mark decided to do with this information will absolutely change everything. Mark spent the following days in a state of mental anguish he had never experienced before. He had all the pieces of the puzzle, but no authority willing to assemble the complete picture with him. The truth was there, screaming silently, and he was the only one who seemed able to hear it. It was then that he made the most important decision of his life. He wasn't going to wait for anyone else to believe him. He wasn't going to depend on bureaucratic systems or skeptical people. If someone was trapped in that house, and everything indicated that there was, he himself was going to do something about it. On November 7th, a cloudy and cold Tuesday, Mark returned to 1847 Maple Street. But this time it was different. He wasn't wearing his postal worker's uniform. He wasn't there fulfilling an official duty. He was there as a human being concerned about another human being, as someone who refused to turn his back on suffering just because it was inconvenient or unlikely. He parked his car on the street and walked purposefully to the balcony. He climbed the same creaking steps. He stopped. Before the same door that had opened a crack days before, he rang the doorbell. Once. The sound echoed through the empty house. He waited. Absolute silence. He rang again. Twice. Nothing. His heart began to sink. What if he had really imagined it all? What if the stress, as everyone said, had finally taken its toll? But then Mark did something that changed everything. Something simple, human, desperate. He shouted, "Eleanor, my name is Mark. I'm the mailman who comes by every day. If you're there and need help, knock on the wall just once and yes." His voice tore through the silence of the empty street. Some neighbors probably heard him and thought he'd finally lost his mind. But Mark no longer cared what they thought of him. He waited. 5 seconds that felt like an eternity. 10 seconds. 15. And then it happened. Thump. A muffled, distant, but unmistakable sound, coming from the second floor of the house. Mark's heart exploded with pure adrenaline. It wasn't his imagination. It was real. Someone was in there. Someone who had heard and responded. He shouted again, this time with tears beginning to well up in his eyes. "Eleanor, are you in danger? Knock twice for yes." And the answer came. Thump. Thump. 2 distinct sounds, separated by a second. A clear, unequivocal, desperate communication. Someone was trapped in that house. Someone was alive. Someone was calling for help in the only way they knew how. Mark pulled out his cell phone, his hands trembling violently. He dialed 911. The operator answered with her usual calm and professional voice. "911, what's your emergency?" And Mark, with an intensity in his voice that came from the depths of his soul, replied, "I need you to come to 1847 Maple Street in Riverside right now. There's someone in danger inside this house. She's trapped in there. I communicated with her by banging on the wall. I don't care if you don't believe me. I don't care if you think I'm crazy. Break down. That damn door if you have to, but do something. A woman is dying while we waste time." There was a pause on the other end of the line. The operator, a professional trained to detect nuances in stressed voices, perceived something different this time. It wasn't irrational panic, it wasn't confusion. It was absolute certainty. It was the voice of someone who knew exactly what they were saying and was willing to face the consequences if they were wrong. "Sir, please remain calm. I'm dispatching. Units to this address now. Police, firefighters, and an ambulance are on their way. Stay on the line with me." Mark leaned against the balcony wall, his legs almost giving way under the weight of emotion. I had done everything I could. He had trusted himself when no one else did. He had followed his intuition against all the social evidence that told him to give up. And now, finally, help was coming. 20 minutes felt like 20 hours. Mark stayed on the porch, looking out at the street, waiting. And then they arrived. Two police cars appeared around the corner with sirens blaring, followed by an ambulance and the red fire truck. The quiet Maple Street exploded in flashing blue and red lights. Neighbors came out to their doors and windows. The house that everyone had forgotten about suddenly became the center of attention. Officer Rodriguez got out of the patrol car, the same officer who had dismissed Mark's account days before. This time, however, his face was serious. Professional. "Mr. Sullivan, are you sure about what you're telling us?" Mark just nodded, unable to speak. Too many emotions overflowing. The firefighters wasted no time. With heavy tools, they broke down the front door. The old wood gave way with a loud crack, and the door swung open. The smell emanating from inside was like a physical wall. Horrible. A nauseating mixture of mold, accumulated dirt, stale air from years of stagnation, and something deeper. The smell of abandonment, of silent suffering. Several police officers recoiled, covering their noses. Mark, even feeling the nausea rising, followed them inside. He needed to see it with his own eyes. He needed to know the whole truth. The house inside was a nightmare frozen in time, furniture covered in thick layers of dust. Framed photos on the walls showed a younger Eleanor, smiling in moments of a life that had been violently interrupted. The living room looked like a museum of abandonment. Magazines from 2011 still sat on the coffee table, a glass with the dried remains of some drink. Everything exactly as it had been left 12 years ago. They climbed the stairs, each step creaking under the weight of the firefighters and police officers. In the second-floor hallway, they immediately saw the master bedroom at the end. The door had a thick padlock installed on the outside. On the outside. Someone had intentionally locked that room to keep someone inside. The firefighter cut the padlock with a special tool. The metal gave way with a click. The door slowly opened, and there was Eleanor Whitmore, alive, but only technically. The scene inside that room would haunt Mark for the rest of his life. Eleanor was sitting on the edge of a dirty bed, so thin she looked like a skeleton covered in skin. She couldn't have weighed more than 40 kilos. Her white hair was long, reaching her waist, tangled and dirty. Her clothes were unrecognizable rags that barely covered her frail body. Beside the bed, dozens of empty plastic water bottles were piled up. Empty protein bar wrappers and dehydrated food formed small mountains in the corners of the room. She had been locked in there for more than 12 years, surviving on the bare minimum, just enough food and water to stay afloat, living in a single room without freedom, without sunlight, without hope. The paramedics rushed in immediately, assessing her vital signs, preparing emergency equipment. Eleanor was in a state of deep shock, dehydrated and critically malnourished. When she saw Mark among the rescuers, her deep eyes fixed on him, and she began to cry. Silent tears streamed down a face that had forgotten what it felt like to experience relief. She couldn't speak properly. Her voice was too weak, but she whispered words that broke the hearts of everyone present. "I saw you through the window," she murmured with extreme difficulty. "Every day passing by. I thought you'd never find me. I thought I was going to die here." The paramedics carefully placed her on a stretcher. Her body was so fragile that they were afraid of breaking it just by moving it. The ambulance sped off with sirens blaring, racing against time. One of the paramedics whispered to Rodriguez. She had at most a few more days if she wasn't found. Maybe hours. Multiple organ failure was beginning. Mark had saved Eleanor literally at the last possible moment. The house became an official crime scene. Yellow tape was stretched out. Forensic investigators began documenting everything. And while Mark stood there watching all the activity, one question hammered in his mind. Who did this? Who was capable of locking an elderly woman in her own room and leaving her there for 12 years? Subscribe to the channel now, because the truth behind this cruel imprisonment is even more shocking than you imagine. The ensuing police investigation revealed a truth so dark it shook the entire Riverside community to its core. In the days following the rescue, while Eleanor fought for her life in the hospital, detectives delved deep into the Whitmore family's financial records, legal documents, and past. What they uncovered was a web of greed, cruelty, and calculated coldness that went far beyond what anyone could have imagined. Vincent Whitmore, the nephew Mr. Patterson had mentioned, was responsible. 38 years old in 2011, Vincent had built a perfect facade of success. Expensive clothes, an imported car, an apartment in Portland. But behind this appearance, he was mired in gambling debts amounting to $340,000, casinos, illegal bets, loans from dangerous loan sharks. He was desperate. And that's when he looked to Eleanor, his unmarried aunt, with no other heirs. Vincent discovered that Eleanor had a substantial inheritance. The house was worth over $800,000. She had accumulated conservative savings from decades of work as a teacher. In all, more than $1 million that would eventually be his. But eventually wasn't fast enough. He needed that money now. And that's when he made the most monstrous decision anyone could make. In September 2011, Vincent visited Eleanor, as he occasionally did. They talked. He made tea for the two of them, a seemingly affectionate gesture. But that tea was drugged. Eleanor lost consciousness. When she woke up hours later, she was locked in her own room. The door had a new padlock installed on the outside. She screamed, banged on the door, pleaded. No one heard. No one came. During the first few weeks, Vincent would sneak in at night, entering through the back door. He would give her water and minimal food, just enough to keep her alive and conscious. And then the psychological blackmail began. He forced Eleanor, through threats and deprivation, to sign documents transferring assets to him, powers of attorney, bank transfers, everything meticulously planned to appear legal. Terrified and with no other options, Eleanor signed. Everything he demanded. When Vincent got what he wanted, when all the papers were signed and the money started flowing into his accounts, he simply stopped showing up. Eleanor was left alone, without food, without water, waiting for death to arrive. But it didn't, because Vincent, however monstrous he was, had calculated something crucial. If Eleanor died and no one found the body, he couldn't legally inherit anything. He would need a death certificate. He would need a body. Then he returned. Once a month, for 12 endless years, Vincent would sneak in through the back door in the middle of the night. He would leave bottles of water and protein bars in the locked room, enough for her to survive another 30 days. Not out of compassion, but out of pure cold calculation. He was keeping Eleanor alive only to protect his inheritance, while she slowly wasted away in that room. It was a meticulously calculated imprisonment, cruel beyond comprehension, monstrous in its coldness. Eleanor survived 12 years in those conditions through sheer willpower. She later told me, in testimony to investigators, that there were days when she wanted to give up. Days when the darkness and loneliness seemed worse than death. But she clung to an almost impossible hope. The hope that someone at some point would realize she was still there. That someone would ring that doorbell and actually pay attention. And Mark had done exactly that. Against all odds, against all skepticism, he had. Rung that doorbell twice, and he saved a life that was literally days away from being extinguished. The hunt for Vincent Whitmore was swift and relentless. As soon as investigators pieced together the complete puzzle and issued an arrest warrant, federal agents began tracking him. Vincent had no idea his aunt had been found. He still thought his dark secret was perfectly safe. 48 hours after Eleanor's rescue, he was located in Las Vegas, at the international airport, attempting to board a flight to Cancun with 2 suitcases full of cash. When the agents approached and told him his name, Vincent knew immediately that it was all over. His face paled. His legs nearly gave way. The charges were devastating. Aggravated kidnapping, attempted murder, multiple counts of financial fraud, aggravated elder abuse, document forgery. The list was so long that the public prosecutor spent 10 minutes just reading all the formal charges. Vincent would face at least 40 years in prison, possibly life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. At 50, he would never see freedom again, and this time there were no locks he could use to protect himself from the consequences of his actions. Meanwhile, Eleanor was fighting for her life at St. Mary's Hospital in Portland. The first few days were critical. Her body had been so battered by years of severe malnutrition that doctors weren't sure if she would recover. But Eleanor, the same woman who had survived 12 years in captivity with nothing but willpower, surprised everyone. Slowly, day by day, she began to grow stronger. 3 weeks later, she was sitting up in bed, talking to nurses, eating solid food. Physically still frail, her body would take months to fully recover. But mentally, surprisingly, she was strong. Stronger than any therapist had expected. Mark visited Eleanor in the hospital as soon as she was strong enough to receive visitors. When he entered the room with flowers in his hands, nervous and emotional, Eleanor looked at him and immediately reached out her hands. Mark approached and she took his hand with a strength that surprised someone so frail. Tears streamed down her face as she said, her voice still weak but firm, "You saved my life. When everyone doubted, when everyone said you were wrong, you believed. You touched me twice, and you gave me a second chance at life." The story exploded nationally within days. Newspapers across the country ran dramatic headlines. The heroics. Postman who didn't give up. Man saves woman held prisoner for 12 years. Postman's intuition solves missing person mystery. Mark Sullivan became an instant celebrity. Television programs invited him over. Reporters camped out in front of his house. Offers for book and film deals poured in daily. But Mark consistently rejected the title of hero. In every interview, with his characteristic humility, he said the same thing. "I only did what anyone should do. I paid attention. I listened to that voice that told me something was wrong. And I acted. I'm not a hero. I'm just someone who refused to ignore someone else's suffering." This genuine simplicity only made people admire him even more. Eleanor, with the help of specialized lawyers, managed to recover all of her belongings that Vincent had stolen. The courts invalidated all forced transfers. She sold the house on Maple Street. She could never live there again. That place represented 12 years of horror that she wanted to leave behind. With the money, she moved to a welcoming assisted living community on the outskirts of Portland, a place with beautiful gardens, kind people, and social activities. Finally, at 79 years old, after having her life stolen for more than a decade, Eleanor began to live again. Subscribe to the channel because the final message of this story will touch your heart in a way you don't expect. This true story teaches us something profoundly powerful about human nature and how small decisions can have monumental impacts. Never ever underestimate your instincts. Never ignore that persistent inner voice that whispers something is wrong, even when the whole world around you is telling you otherwise. Mark could have easily given up. After the laughter from his co-workers, after the polite skepticism from the police, after his own wife suggested he needed rest, any reasonable person would have abandoned the idea, would have concluded they were wrong. But Mark wasn't just anyone. He trusted what he saw. He trusted that visceral feeling that had been bothering him for years, and because of that unwavering self-confidence, he saved a human life. Think for a moment. How many abandoned houses are there around us? I'm not just talking about empty physical structures. I'm talking about people. How many invisible people walk among us, trapped in their own silent suffering, waiting for someone to pay enough attention to notice? How many times do we pass someone who is screaming inside but smiling on the outside? How many Eleanor Whitmores are there in the world, waiting for someone to ring the doorbell twice? The truth is, we live in a society that teaches us not to get involved, not to ask too many questions, not to cause trouble, to accept official explanations and move on, and most of the time that works well. But sometimes, this collective mentality of indifference costs lives. It costs dignity. It costs humanity. And that's why stories like Mark Sullivan's are so important. They remind us that we are allowed to trust ourselves, that we are allowed to question, that we are allowed and indeed responsible for acting when our hearts tell us something is fundamentally wrong. Eleanor Whitmore is still alive today. At 81 years old, she has become an inspiring speaker on resilience, trauma, and the power of unwavering hope. She travels the country sharing her story with survivor groups, students, and mental health professionals. And in every talk she always mentions the same crucial point. There were days in that room when I wanted to give up, days when the darkness seemed stronger than my will to live. But then I would hear the mailman's footsteps downstairs, passing by on the street as always. And that simple sound reminded me that there was still goodness in the world, that there were still people fulfilling their duties with dignity, and that gave me the strength to endure another day. Eleanor's transformation is a testament to humanity's incredible capacity for healing. After 12 stolen years, she chose not to live in hatred or bitterness. She chose to use her experience to inspire others, to show that no matter how dark the night, dawn always comes for those who persevere. And Mark, the man who saved her life, returned to his job as a mailman. He refused lucrative offers. He said his place was on the streets of Riverside, delivering mail, paying attention, being that consistent point of human connection that someone somewhere might be depending on. The journey of these two human beings shows us something essential about life. It's not always grand, heroic actions that change the world. Sometimes it's simply an ordinary person's refusal to ignore their conscience. It's ringing the doorbell twice when once would have been enough. It's believing when everyone doubts. It's acting when it would be easier to just walk away. If you've made it this far, it's because this story touched you in some way. And I wanted to thank you for that, for staying with me until the end, for giving your time and attention to learn about Mark and Eleanor's journey. That means so much more than you can imagine. If this content resonated with you, if it touched your heart in any way or made you reflect on your own life, leave a like below. It's not just a little button. It's you telling me that it's worthwhile to continue bringing these real stories that remind us of the goodness that still exists in the world. And subscribe to the channel if you haven't already, because every week I bring stories like this that restore our faith in humanity and make us believe that small actions can change lives. And hey, leave a comment saying, "I'm with you until the end." That way I know you really watched everything and absorbed the message. I love reading each of your comments, and often it's you who give me ideas for future videos. There's a video over here that perfectly complements this topic, showing other stories of ordinary people who did extraordinary things simply by paying attention. Click and continue watching it. I'm sure you'll enjoy it as much as you enjoyed this one. Thanks again for being here. See you in the next video.